And now the spiel. Jimmy Carter, the first president to be born in a hospital until the next one, the last to pass away, is widely celebrated for his work on environmental protection, Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, and human rights advocacy. Of course, one might note that the world remains in dire straits when it comes to environmental protection, Arab-Israeli peace, and human rights. Still, consider how much worse things might have been without Jimmy Carter. Probably a little worse. During the last few decades, Carter generally floated about as a sort of cardigan-wearing angel of decency. It's all lovely work, especially if you enjoy watching nonagenarians swing hammers and don't mind the occasional anti-Israel calumny. But there is a reality lurking behind the feel-good stories. No amount of well-intentioned globetrotting can pay back the average American's decimated savings account in the period between 1977 and 1980 for all of Carter's other praiseworthy post-presidential deeds or laudable personal qualities. Americans would have been and would be to this day much better off if Carter had managed to tame inflation, or at least approached it with a semblance of an effective plan. There's substantial evidence that while presidents have limited power to drive an economy to great heights, they hold considerable ability to derail it. Now, of course, when Jimmy Carter took office, the economy was mediocre. Gerald Ford oversaw a period of high inflation, but a recession ended under his watch, and the economy grew by about 5.5% during his tenure. Under Carter, the economy grew an average of only 2.8%, and inflation grew from 5.2% the month he entered office to over 13% by his last full month as president. According to an analysis by Texas A&M, real wages fell during Carter's tenure by 8.1%. This is by far the worst rate of any president since Carter. Now, to be fair, a lot of this might have been the fault of Nixonian policies. Still, the evidence shows that America's economic decline was exacerbated by Jimmy Carter's misplaced and ineffective leadership. Even at the time, experts, democratically inclined experts, were suggesting that whatever poor hand Carter was dealt, he played it even worse. Stephen Hess, writing for Brookings in 1978, argued that Carter's approach to governing and leadership was fundamentally flawed and decidedly unpolitician-like. He described him as a process president, which is an assessment largely echoed, though not in those exact words, by someone who would definitely know Stuart Eisenstadt. Eisenstadt was Carter's chief White House domestic policy advisor, a member of his campaign team, and the author of one of the most comprehensive insider accounts of the mechanics and policy battles of any presidential administration. And Eisenstadt is blunt in his assessment of the key issue that defined the Carter presidency.
Our Achilles heel domestically was one of the four I's, inflation. We inherited high inflation, and it got worse in our administration. And Carter called us in mid-1979 as we're looking to a re-election campaign, and he said, I've tried everything to deal with this embedded inflation. 2 anti-inflation czars, 5 anti-inflation speeches, voluntary wage and price guidelines, cutting domestic spending to satisfy financial markets and alienating the liberal wing in the process. Nothing's worked.
I've interviewed Eisenstadt on The Gist. I've read his book. I've researched his tenure. I looked up his speeches. I read the oral history he gave to the Miller Center. The man is highly complimentary of Carter. He's certainly not worshipful, but still, he describes a presidency that began with lofty ideals of decentralized decision-making, but quickly bogged down on issues that a better managed administration might have handled more effectively. Eisenstadt said, the biggest error we made from really the outset, from the transition of 76 all the way through, was underestimating the basic strength of the economy and underestimating the gravity of the underlying inflationary forces. It was the strength and vitality of those inflationary forces that led us to have a major stimulus package in 77, when perhaps we would have been better off with either none or a very small one. It led us to another tax cut in 78, which we didn't need. It led us to recognize the need for an anti-inflation program too late. And it ultimately led us to do too little, too late with inflation, which was huge. I would argue the whole game. In Eisenstadt's book, in his interviews, he makes it clear that the very thing for which Carter is so widely praised today, his energy policy, was in fact a misplaced priority. Not a bad policy, but just the wrong one to prioritize. Far from being the triumph that it's often heralded as, Carter's focus on energy and the environment actually hindered the administration's ability to deliver economic improvements that could have been far more impactful to the daily lives of Americans. I'll quote Eisenstadt again. The whole election was fought over the recession, not over energy. Energy was an extremely minor issue in the campaign. And here we were, putting together on a crash basis something that was going to be a centerpiece of Carter's domestic policy and a centerpiece of his presidency when it had not reached the level of public attention as even being an issue. Carter ran a shockingly shambolic ship, culminating in an unprecedented cabinet firing and rehiring that, had it occurred today, would have set 24-hour news and social media ablaze. Cabinet officials were required to reapply for their jobs and to fill out evaluation forms assessing their subordinates on the rubrics of ability, performance, and loyalty. Not just the ones that Carter was targeting, everyone. Vice President Walter Mondale was part of the deal. And it was just a chaotic spectacle. Several secretaries outright refused to comply. Some tore up their forms. They soon became ex-secretaries. Then in the second half of the Carter presidency, the Iranian Revolution happened. No thanks to Carter. The CIA certainly deserves a lot of the credit or blame for the massive failure of intelligence. But months after Khomeini assured Carter that the revolution would be peaceful, it was, towards Khomeini, but Iran seized 53 Americans as hostages, and Carter's presidency was effectively doomed. Now, my first motivation in assembling the précis of Carter's failure was just that I was getting a little annoyed at the coverage of Carter's death. The issue of Carter's legacy, I think, was being mistaken. Carter definitely deserves laurels as a humanitarian. He was a kind, nice person. I've had personal interactions with him over the years. He was very nice. I was very proud to have gone to a college where he would stop in and lecture on classes. And we've even met in small groups where we talked about power and the presidency in real life. And it was great. It was a joy to talk to Jimmy Carter. But the presidency, the office of the presidency, is so much more powerful than anything anyone can do in private life, and so much more capable of having a massive impact on the life of Americans, that more emphasis should be given to the fact that Jimmy Carter really did mishandle the economy. And it wasn't that he was set up for failure or dealt an impossible hand or was the victim of his predecessor's mistakes. I mean, all that's true, but it's true for every other president and every other leader. Jimmy Carter mishandled acute crises and ongoing crises, and the American people suffered. This is why, during his presidency, Jimmy Carter was unpopular, precisely because he failed to deliver tangible results to the American people. And that's important. According to Habitat for Humanity, the Carter Work Project, which he did with the organization, worked with over 108,000 volunteers and built, renovated, or repaired more than 4,447 homes in 14 countries. So does that mean 4,448? I don't know why people ever say more than 4,447. Anyway, it's all wonderful. It really is. I'm not gainsaying it. I'm not diminishing it. But do you know what even shaving 2 points off of inflation would have done for the wealth of the American people, for their ability to afford everything, including housing? It is so many orders of magnitude more than the charity he engaged in post-presidency. And I think of this now as the Democratic Party engages in recriminations, with the consensus being, and you hear this all the time, we the Democrats need to be the party of working Americans. Americans need to look to us as sticking up for the common American. Well, how you do that is create economic conditions where everyone flourishes. like rising real wages and lower costs of living. That's how you do that. So when you hear people praising Jimmy Carter for his great environmentalism and being the first president to install solar panels in the White House.
Today, in directly harnessing the power of the sun, we are taking the energy that God gave us, the most renewable energy that we will ever see, and using it to replace our dwindling supplies of fossil fuels.
But when you talk about that and emphasizing environmental policy and negotiating hard on deregulating natural gas instead of putting your efforts into tackling inflation, well, the people who are praising him for environmentalism are certainly right that he pursued good or nice policies symbolically, to some extent, tangibly. But what doomed him was that he failed on the really important thing, the economy, inflation. So I ask you, if you notice that the same people saying, here's what the Democrats need to do, be identified with the economy, when those same people are going back and looking at Carter saying the best thing about him is what he did on the environment, shouldn't you at least question how genuine the assertion is that the values of Democrats have to be economic conditions of the average person? Because when given that exact choice, Jimmy Carter chose wrong, and he's being praised for it now. So let that be a lesson or a takeaway from the hosannas he's receiving from the Democratic establishment. And look, it all just might be a case of not speaking ill of the dead, but I really do think that the same voices saying Democrats must care about the economy are now saying one of the 4 Democratic presidents of my lifetime deserves the most praise for choosing to do something other than address the economy. Jimmy Carter was certainly a kind, decent man, a laudable humanitarian, a good human being. And still, no amount of post-presidential achievements can ever match the potential impact of effectively wielding the office of the most powerful person on earth. Carter's presidency was anemic. No personal qualities of decency or benevolence can change that fact, despite the efforts of kind-hearted obituary writers.